All right, we're here with Cory Doctorow, author of Radicalized. How are you doing today, sir?
Yeah, very well, thank you. It's been an energizing show.
Yeah, we appreciate you taking a little bit of time out of your schedule to talk with us today. If you want to give our listeners a little bit of your background, I know you have your own website and you're a little bit of an activist, so if you just want to give us a little bit of your background.
Yeah, I'm a science fiction novelist. I've written more than 20 books, about half of them novels, and I also am one of the owners of a website called Boing Boing. We write about technology and culture. It's one of the original blogs. We're like 20 years old now and got millions of readers. And I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is a civil rights group based in San Francisco. And for 30 years, we've been campaigning for life online without surveillance, where people are free to express themselves, and against monopolies and lots of other issues that have become much more important now, net neutrality and so on. We've been banging that drum a long time. I used to be their European director. I lived in London for a long time.
Okay.
And I'm a visiting professor of computer science at the Open University in the UK, where I used to live, and a visiting professor of practice of library science at the University of North Carolina, and a research affiliate at MIT at the Media Lab.
Well, then, yes, we're very lucky to be able to get this time with you. You sound like an unbelievably busy man. So I started reading Radicalized this week once you guys sent me the copy, and I tend to get the feeling that with the way technology is going, you kind of see a bleaker future for humanity than most.
You know, I'm the kind of nerd who has a favorite law review article, and my favorite law review article is written by a guy named Michael Weinberg, who used to be a counsel at Public Knowledge, this big activist group in D.C., and it's called "This Will All Be So Great If We Don't Screw It Up." And I think that the reason to care about technology is not merely because getting it wrong will be so terrible, but because getting it right could be so wonderful.
Well, there are many that believe with automation and AI on the bright side will come a second coming of the Renaissance and leave a lot of people the free time and ability, because we won't be so driven into the labor force that we can once again focus on arts and things like that. But there is also the side of, the negative side where capitalism holds on to the technology and we all just become mass consumers and just digits that fund these mega corporations. I got the feeling that you're more towards viewing that we're destined for the latter.
No, not at all. I just think that if we have to do something. Actually, the thing is, I don't believe in destiny. I'm not an optimist or a pessimist, because either one of those involves making a prediction about the future. And if you think the future is predictable, there's no reason to get out of bed in the morning. The future changes based on what we do. And I think that one of the ways that you can activate people to demand a better future is by writing about how bad it can be, and another way is to write about how good it can be. And I've done both. Both of those, I think, are valid ways to intervene. The most important thing about technology is not what it does, but who it does it to and who it does it for. There's an adoption curve for terrible technology, where if we have a bad technological idea, first we impose it on people who can complain the least, and then we work our way up as we find ways to make it more palatable or to normalize it. So, the first people to experience terrible technology are usually refugees, then regular immigrants, and then prisoners, paroled prisoners, school children, kids at home, and then blue-collar workers and gig economy workers, and then the wider world. And, I think that science fiction is not a great way to find out about the future, but if you want to kind of get a sense of what your technological future is going to look like, look at the terrible things that we're doing to your kids' age, and then add 10 years and imagine that technology will be for you. And if you want to know what your kids' are going to be using, look at the terrible technology we're imposing on refugees today, and that'll be the stuff that'll be normalized for kids: tracking cuffs and CCTVs and facial recognition, all of those other things.
So what are a few of the things that you think we're actually doing well that give you a little bit of optimism and that we can steer the ship towards that Renaissance kind of age?
Well, I mean, all of the things that are terrible are great, right? I mean, Facebook is amazing because it helps people with rare, widely distributed, hard to locate traits discover each other. And that's how you get radical political movements that are demanding racial justice and that are demanding economic justice. It's how people with rare diseases find each other. It's also how people who are Nazis find each other, because although Nazis are loud, terrible, dangerous, and need to be dealt with, they're not in the majority. They're so widely spread that if it wasn't for something like Facebook, it would be hard for them to get together and solve the collective action problem.
So is it safe to say you have faith in the mass community of just good people being able to connect with each other?
No, not at all. No. I think that the downside of Facebook is that Facebook's business model is figuring out how to get you to spend a lot of time on the site. And if you found a bunch of people who have the same rare disease as you and you check in every day for a few minutes, that's a perfectly pleasant experience, but it doesn't make Facebook any money. And so Facebook non-consensually rams Trump headlines into your eyeballs every time you go and try and talk to someone about your rare disease, which gets you to click on Facebook more. So I don't think that people solve this just by being of goodwill. I think people solve this by demanding that Facebook be broken up and held to account.
That leads me to another subject I kind of wanted to hear your views on is, the monetization of just our everyday life, having to be in kind of more of a digital world, just being a part of that digital world. People are monetizing off of our metadata. 23andMe is now just sold everybody's DNA results to
Plus
a massive
they reserve the right to
corporation.
patent things that they find in your genome, which is disgusting.
And there's no compensation for the actual people supplying this information that companies are profiting off of. What do you feel is the best way to kind of remedy this business model? Because it just seems to be churning and churning as we go by.
So, there's this very glib saying that if you're not paying for the product, you're the product. But the reality is it doesn't matter whether you're paying for the product or the product. We've had 40 years of market concentration because Ronald Reagan decided that antitrust didn't need to be enforced anymore. We now have a world with 4 publishers, 4 movie studios, 4 record labels, 2 big comics publishers, 5 big tech companies, 2 big cable operators, and they will figure out how to monetize you however they want to monetize you. So, Apple says we're not selling your data. Well, yeah, they're not selling your data, but they did kill 16 right to repair bills in 16 state legislatures last year to make sure that you could only get your phone repaired by them, and they could decide when it wasn't repairable anymore and could force it to be retired, so you'd have to buy another one. They did that the same year that they warned their investors that their biggest potential hit to their earnings was that people weren't buying new iPhones anymore. They were holding on to them. So, you can pay $1,000 for an iPhone and still be the product. They're not selling your data. They're just selling you to repair shops. One way or the other, it doesn't matter. And the only answer is to start reforming monopolies, right? So long as companies don't have to fear competition. Facebook lost 15 million American users last year, aged 13 to 35. They all went to Instagram, which is a Facebook division, right?
So you think you're switching, you're essentially not.
In any sane world, Facebook should not own Instagram. And the way Facebook has attained its growth is by buying or crushing or buying and crushing every nascent competitor. It's stuff that wasn't countenanced after the breakup of Standard Oil and the other big robber barons, and that we shouldn't have countenanced after Reagan, and we need to right the wrong of it. We can talk about like using copyright to protect artists or a million other things. None of those things are going to work until we have effective monopoly control. Like if you only have 5 companies you can sell your copyrights to, it doesn't matter how much copyright we get from governments as creators. They'll just take that too. If your kid's being bullied for their lunch money and going hungry, giving them more money won't get them lunch. Right? The bullies will just take that money too. We need effective regulation of the monopolies first.
So that brings us to your digital rights management kind of activism. How do you see that kind of forming? Because, as the one side is, like you said, there's only a monopoly on publishers and it doesn't really matter how you do it. But at the same time, we have a problem with torrenting and, I remember the days of Napster and things like that.
What's the problem with them?
How do you make sure that creators are still being able to monetize themselves and be in control of their properties?
Well, we've had this problem a million times, right? And what we do is we take away control and we give back money. So, when the first phonograms came along, the people who'd written sheet music were like, how dare these trained monkeys who've been getting our sheet music and performing it in their living room now start selling it on records. We didn't say, John Philip Sousa went to Congress in 1908. He said, if these infernal talking machines are allowed to continue, we will lose our voice boxes as we lost our tails when we came down out of the trees, right? So the way that we solved that is we created a blanket license, and that blanket license allowed anyone to record anything. That's how Sid Vicious recorded My Way. Paul Anka never gave him permission. And that blanket license pays artists a set rate, and it allows anyone to record anything. That's how we got the record industry. And then, radio came along, and they started playing records on the radio. And the people who'd stolen the sheet music and said that that was legitimate progress, they said that was fine, but when you take our records and play them on the radio, that's just plain theft. And there was a long fight. It was super racialized. The big collecting society that wouldn't let music for poor people and music for black people in, they wouldn't let in country music and the blues. They did a deal with radio, and then ASCAP, who represented white respectable artists, came along because they finally were dragged into it. But we got a blanket license with radio too, right? And then along came cable. Cable operators are sucking in broadcast signals without paying for them. And the radio operators who'd condemned the phonogram makers, who'd been condemned by the sheet music makers, they said, well, when we did it, that was progress. When you do it, it's theft. Along came the VCR. The cable operators sued over the VCR. And they said, when we took broadcast signals, that was progress. Just as when the broadcasters took phonograms, that was progress. Just as when the phonogram record manufacturers took sheet music, that was progress. But when you do it, it's theft. Then along came Napster, and Sony, the company that made the VCR, sued Napster. And they said, when we did it, it was progress, and when you do it, it's theft. And every time money talks, BS walks, you get artists paid, they give up control. We could have blanket licenses for the internet administered by super transparent 21st century collecting societies that weren't corrupt like existing ones, that were run with all the transparency of a Linux project, and we could get artists paid instead of setting them against their fans.
Sony lawsuits against ended up giving us the Spotifys, the Pandoras, the streaming age of digital music, because the people took the monetary value out of that physical copy commodity, and now we've moved more towards a streaming age that kind of just puts all the content out there, and they're still kind of working out the bugs.
Well, no, but those bugs, that's the important piece, right? Pandora, Spotify, the other big streaming players, they send billions to the labels. The labels just don't give any of it to the artist. There's this story, oh, well, a stream only pays you a fraction of a cent. Well, a radio play only pays you a fraction of a cent per listener. That's what a stream is, right? It's one listener. The rates are fully comparable. The problem is that the contract that you sign when there's only 4 record labels, the contracts are uniformly terrible. You know, every one of those contracts has a deduction out of your royalties for something called breakage. It's a line item that dates back to phonograms, and it represents the number of vinyl record albums broken on the truck between the warehouse and Tower Records. They deduct it from your digital royalties, right? So, you know, we can sit here all day and talk about how it's the audience's fault for not wanting to listen to music in the most profitable way. The reality is that there's more money in the recording industry than there has ever been today. Inflation adjusted, there has been massive growth since the time of Napster and before Napster.
Well, I do feel a lot of the answer to this is being an informed consumer. You know, your money does have power, where you spend it, who you give it to, things like that. Even if you only take a few small personal stances in boycotts, you know, we can't boycott everything. We, like you said, with the monopolies we have nowadays, you'll starve to death if you really try to boycott major food companies and this. And how do you feel that consumers can be more smart in where they give their money, who they give it to?
So you should do your best, for sure. Support Patreon. I've got, you know, I sell my ebooks on behalf of my publisher, so you can buy them from me instead of Jeff Bezos. I take the 25% Jeff Bezos would trouser, I put that in my pocket, give the money back to my publisher, and then they take the 30% royalty and they give it back to me. So, you know, you can do that if you want, right? But ultimately, this is not an individual matter, right? I mean, you can't shop your way out of monopoly capitalism. It's like trying to recycle your way out of climate change, right? This is a collective problem. Now, 10 years ago, there wasn't much you could do individually apart from trying to spend money in the smartest way possible. But now we have actual politicians advancing real policy programs that demand change. So in the EU, Margrethe Vestager, the European Commissioner on Competition, just fined Google another $5 billion for monopoly practices. Here, you've got Liz Warren running for president saying she's going to unwind these mergers in big tech. I'm waiting for her to say that she's going to unwind the mergers in content and unwind the mergers in telecoms, because those need to be unwound too, to say nothing of banks, railroads, and all the other industries that have been allowed to concentrate into 4 or 5 companies with no real difference between them. But you know, that's where you can make a difference, right? Because these are collective problems. These are big social problems that don't have individual answers to them.
Another topic that has interested me, and I'd like to know your feelings on, is public domain.
Yeah.
So you have a company like Disney who has used public domain to make a fortune. You know, Little Mermaid is public domain, Cinderella's public domain.
Snow White.
And now they're getting so old that Mickey Mouse was about to hit public domain. They donated hundreds of millions of dollars to the government to get that public domain years stretched out. And now they're going to hit public domain again, I think, in another 8 years, to where Mickey Mouse isn't trademarkable anymore. Right? Anybody can make a Mickey Mouse shirt. Anybody can make a Mickey Mouse story once it hits public domain. Do you see a problem as the art starts to catch up to, you know, modern law, with companies now trying to change the rules that they took advantage of to fit them now?
Sure. In 1998, they passed the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act that hit pause on the public domain. So it used to be that every year, the works from X years ago, whatever the term of copyright was, went into the public domain. They hit pause for 20 years. So nothing went into the public domain for 20 years. It was the first year that anything entered the public domain in the US, but also they took materials published in the past 20 years and put them back under copyright. And so this would have been the year to pass another, what's called a retrospective term extension, where you go back and you add more copyright to works that have already been created. It's very hard to understand how that's good policy. You know, the Constitution sets out the basis for copyright. It says, to promote the useful arts and sciences, Congress may establish monopolies of limited times. So first of all, it's not limited times if you just keep extending it. But also, you can't promote new works by adding copyright to old works, right? Giving Disney more copyright on works they made in 1923 won't make more works from 1923 available, right? You could give them new incentives for new works if you thought there was a problem of underproduction, but there's no incentive for a retrospective term extension because you're not going to go back in time and make more stuff now that the works that you already made have more copyright. So there's no reason, no good policy reason to do it. And as you say, we enjoy many brilliant works because copyright expires. Now, trademark doesn't expire. Trademark is, so long as it's enforced, is, you know, effectively perpetual. Trademark is much more limited than copyright. So long as there's no confusion about the origin of a good or service, you can make a new work without infringing a trademark. So what that means is that when the early Mickey cartoons start to go in the public domain in a few years, you're going to be able to make Mickey cartoons, provided you do so in a way that doesn't confuse over the origin of those cartoons, that everyone knows they're not authorized by Disney, which is great. It's how you can have multiple studios that are making Little Mermaid cartoons. You know, even though Disney has trademarks over their Little Mermaid, if there's no confusion about which Little Mermaid you're talking about, there's no problem. Disney, this was their moment to introduce term extension. Congress has been very busy. They've been very busy passing terrible laws and also doing a lot of nothing.
You know, a subjective term.
And on the one hand, you might have expected, well, they could have created they could have gone in, and in the same way that you got, for example, the tax plan that was such a, you know, so lacking in an evidentiary footing, maybe something just as vacuous like copyright term extension might have been introduced. But on the other hand, it's such a petty grift relative to the incredible literal trillions that they're sucking out of the economy with the tax scam, that it's just kind of small potatoes. And so I don't see it happening. I also think that when it was passed in 1998, although all the experts thought it was this, most people aren't copyright experts, and most people hadn't heard of it, and most people didn't give a damn. There's actually a sizable constituency who think that copyright term extension is terrible, and I think that it'd be very hard for them to introduce it at this point. Although that said, you know, they just reopened the NAFTA negotiations with Canada and Mexico. I'm Canadian, and as part of the Canadian deal, we just retrospectively extended copyright for 20 years to harmonize with the U.S., to go to the same term that was created in the Sonny Bono Act. So we just put Orwell back in the public domain, back in copyright. A whole bunch of other works just went back into copyright in Canada. It's very bad policy. But we never had that debate in Canada before, so people weren't as activated on it. I think that in 20 years, there will be no question of a retrospective term extension. Okay,
before we wrap up, I just want to let you have an opportunity to let our listeners know a little bit about Radicalize, your latest book. You're fascinating to talk to, so I want to make sure that our listeners know exactly where to find your work, what they're mostly about.
Sure. So Radicalize is my new book. It collects 4 novellas on very contemporary, anxious themes. The first one is called Unauthorized Bread. It's about refugees whose Internet of Things enabled housing just sucks every dollar they have out of their pocket. Their dishwasher only washes authorized dishes, and the toaster only toasts authorized bread, and they have to pay over the odds for all of this stuff, which is bad enough, but then it stops working, which is even worse. But when they start jailbreaking it, they discover this newfound technological power, which is great until the companies come back out of bankruptcy, and now they're in danger of being discovered. And since jailbreaking is a felony now, thanks to the 1998 Digital Millennium Copyright Act, these people face deportation back to the countries they fled in fear of their lives. So the stakes go way up. The second story is a story called Model Minority. It's a Superman story about Superman getting involved in a potentially fatal beating of an African-American man by the NYPD cops who killed Eric Garner. And he decides that it's finally time for him to be an ally. And that prompts a bunch of questions like, why did it take him so long? And how long will he continue to enjoy his borrowed white privilege as an alien who's neither white nor human once he throws his lot in against white supremacy? And it doesn't help that Batman is the billionaire who sold the city their predictive policing tools. The third one is called Radicalized. It's the title story. And it asks the question how it is that you have angry white dudes who kill their ex-wives like crazy and who kill brown people in mosques like crazy, but none of them ever seem to kill the healthcare executives who doom their loved ones to terrible deaths from preventable illnesses by disallowing their insurance claims. And what would happen if the kind of radicalization that we see with, say, incels were to target those vulnerable people?
That always fascinates me is where people choose to point their anger.
Yeah,
there's a lot of
sure.
things in society that drive that anger. And it always seems like when they focus it into a fine line, they aim it in the totally wrong places
Sure.
of what truly caused that reaction in the first place.
I mean, there are very many examples of that from our recent political history. I mean, the fact that the armed far right was very angry about the imaginary children of Pizzagate and totally indifferent to the real children of the Kids in Cages scandal is a pretty important example of that. And the last story, it's called Mask of the Red Death, and it's trying to dig into some of those questions. It's a story about preppers, people who think that what they need to do when the end of the world comes is go hide in a hole with thumb drives full of Bitcoin and gemstone quality precious stones and gold bullion and lots of MREs, and then when all the poor suckers have finished shooting each other and rebooting civilization, they can come out and kind of have a Frazetta painting life where they get to be warlords with harems forever. And what they're missing is that the actual heroes of the apocalypse are the ones who get the sanitation running again. And if you fail to do that, everybody dies of cholera. And, it doesn't really matter how many guns you have because you can't shoot germs.
No, well, it's been fascinating sitting here to talk to you. I know you're a busy man. If you just want to give our listeners a quick place where they can find you, whether you're Twitter or, like you said, Boing Boing.
Usually if you search Cory on Google, Cory, I'm the first result. You can go to craphound.com as my personal site. I'm one of the owners of boingboing.net, which is an old, long-standing blog and culture site. And you can find me on Twitter at Doctorow, which is my surname, Doctorow.
Again, thank you very much for your time. It was truly fascinating.
Thank you very much. It was nice to meet you.